Hello and welcome. It is episode number 28 of the Hilarious Humanitarians podcast. I am Frances Echeverria, licensed marriage and family therapist, and we are going to be talking all about anxiety today. Unfortunately, Deanna Silverman, my co-host, is out sick, so I've got a special stand-in who's going to be joining me. We're going to meet Cynthia in just a second. But before we get started, I do want to thank you again for listening. You can go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. Please do so. We're on all the major distributors for podcasts. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe and rate. Tell your friends, grab their phones and subscribe for them if they haven't figured that part out on their nifty smartphone. I want to remind you that the Hilarious Humanitarians podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. It's not a substitute either for advice, diagnosis, or treatment. So please, if you need to, talk to your physician, mental health professional, or other qualified provider regarding a mental health or medical condition. So joining me here on the podcast for my first time doing this all by myself, it's Cynthia. Hi.
Hello. Hello.
So to start, first of all, we're going to be talking about anxiety, and I'm throwing you right into an absolutely anxiety-provoking situation, aren't I?
Oh, I had prickly neck and some nausea this morning. There was some sweating happening unexpectedly over a bowl of cereal, so that was new.
So the way this went down is we were trying to record and Deanna is sick. And so I said, well, I think I have a really funny friend I've known for a long time. And when I started the podcast with Deanna, when we started this, you had mentioned if this was your fault. You said, if you ever want somebody to talk about an anxiety experience, then you'd be the one.
I totally did it to myself. I have nobody but to blame but me.
All right. So before I get into the different categories of anxiety, and I'm going to be doing that, by the way, I'm going to give you some clinical definitions of anxiety disorders because, Cynthia, you could agree that people throw around this I have anxiety thing pretty freely.
Definitely. I mean, anxiety, anybody that likes anything neat thinks they have OCD. It can be super trivializing for people that actually suffer on a daily basis. So definitely, I would agree with that.
All right, we're going to be talking about that, as I mentioned, from the clinical perspective, also strategies to cope with your anxiety, because there are ways that you can do it as simply as doing some mindfulness techniques all the way to prescription and medical intervention. Also today, we are going to talk about self-care because that is an important part of treating and dealing with anxiety, pushing your comfort zone, which is stuff I like to bring up every week. And we'll also provide some feel-good news and listener shout-outs. Okay, so as we're jumping into anxiety today, I want to start by letting you get a good feel of who Cynthia is and why she's joining me on the show. It's like I'm talking to Deanna because Deanna has these little tiny hands and tiny feet. And you have upped the ante on that with what is behind you in your home office right now. So as we're getting started on this podcast all about anxiety, I promise you we will get to that. Get to know a little bit about Cynthia. Explain the parts.
So I have an odd hobby where I've decided to collect various vintage baby doll parts. And what better way to display them than to dismember and put them into a very large mason jar?
I love my friends so very much.
So if I'll just grab it. So Frances, you can describe to our audience what you're seeing here.
Well, so mason,
it's very there's just
little body parts.
Just little body parts.
So mason jars are like the new way to do everything. I mean, I drink out of them. I don't have wine glasses. I drink out of a mason jar.
Well, they're so multi-purpose.
They
right?
are. I mean, and now they work as decorative devices for things like burning candles and collecting vintage baby doll parts. So
preserving history.
Exactly. Keeping it airtight for future generations.
Absolutely.
So Cynthia, before we get into breaking down anxiety and doing the clinical part, do you mind sharing a little bit of your story? I'm not sure where you want to start and how deep you want to go, but I'll just be honest. There was a period of time where you kind of disappeared.
Correct.
That's fair. Me calling her out right now.
That's fair.
You did. And as one of your friends, it's one of these things as friends where we're like, hey, we're here when you need it. and when you're ready, but some stuff you just got to deal with on your own.
Sure. Well, I guess I'll just try to back into it.
Mm-hmm.
I was officially diagnosed as having generalized anxiety disorder when I was right around 22 or 23. But in learning about anxiety on the whole and reflecting back to my teenage years and my childhood, I think that I was anxious from the get-go. I don't necessarily think that it's something that developed in me over time. I think it's something that grew more severe, but I also think it's just always kind of been a part of me. Some people, we all have different traits. We all have different idiosyncrasies. And I think that for me, anxiety was just a part of who I was. But I didn't realize that or recognize that because it was also just my normal. When you don't know any different, you think that that's kind of just how everybody is. And so in learning more about anxiety, talking to doctors, talking to friends, and, at that point, people opening up about mental health issues was really kind of new. Late 90s, early 2000s, there was still kind of the stigma, and so there wasn't a lot of talk. But in talking to people and talking to doctors, I kind of realized that some of those behaviors that I had when I was a child and when I was a teenager were absolutely anxiety driven. So anxiety's been a huge part of my life forever, although it's just kind of been my normal.
And it's funny how once you get perspective on that, you start to realize the coping skills you might have put in place even from a young age to manage that type of anxiety.
Oh, totally. Whether they're healthy coping skills or not, in those moments, you just want to feel better. And so you do what you need to do to feel better, whether it's healthy to do so or not.
Do you remember any, before you got officially diagnosed and started getting some treatment and developing some like healthier approaches, do you remember things you might have done when you were really anxious and experiencing that now you look back and you're like, oh my gosh, it all makes perfect sense?
Well, so along with having the anxiety, I also had this extreme need, I guess, to please my parents and to be perfect and to not really show signs of distress. So for me, so much of it was internalized that a lot of those coping skills weren't really coping at all, I guess. It was just kind of internalizing and bottling up. And then occasionally, privately, it would just be this fountain of emotion that would come out because I didn't know how to deal with it as it came. I didn't know how to deal with it as it, to roll with it as it came in. I don't really know that answered your question.
No, it does, because sometimes our coping skills are when we're in moments of distress, we either turn that energy outward, and that's where you see more of the kind of acting out, or we turn it inward. And I think, I don't have numbers in front of me, but you and I share a lot of the same kind of historical traits in terms of growing up. And I remember being super anxious, but I didn't want to disturb anybody. So you just, like you said, you hold that in. And one thing I wanted to bring up is that point you made about it being something that's followed you throughout life. We've talked about on the show about attachment styles and the way that you connect to your primary caregivers and how that can impact how you relate to people. We've talked about this in terms of dating. If you're an anxious type person, you're the one that like always needs the reassurance. If you have an avoidant attachment, there's always this kind of keeping people at arm's length type of thing. And a lot of that's tied to your very early relationships with your caregivers. But I think that there is very much a biological component to this. And I actually had this happen in two ways. One, I work for a psychiatrist, and I finally there's a test out there, and we've talked about this, where you can get your neurotransmitters basically tested, right? Your levels. And looking at the levels and where my brain chemistry is at, even on medication, he was talking about, those low here and this high here, like that's causing this. And that can be a biological component for why you're anxious. So there is very much like a science to it. It's not necessarily just those early attachments. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
And one other thing that kind of, this part, I don't remember if I sent this to you because it was interesting. I have a daughter, she's 10, and both my kids are anxious. And this is where I go, like, it's got to be hereditary, because I try and keep that shit under control because I don't want to pass it on. we're driving home the other day and I've noticed she's been a little more clingy and she's just crying in the front seat. You've met my daughter. She's a
Sure.
smart kid, mature, people pleaser, a little bit of an attitude, and always pokes at her brother and then acts like, who, me? But anyway, we started having a conversation and she's super anxious about a trip we're taking next month. We're going to Canada. Do you know what her biggest fear is?
Oh boy. Meeting Justin Bieber.
You think she's afraid of two things. She's afraid of the ship we're going to be on sinking. It's going to be a cruise ship. And she's also afraid of sharks in the ocean that might somehow get on the cruise ship.
Oh,
well, it makes no sense. But
that's anxiety though.
And that's the thing we have to keep in mind is anxiety sometimes makes zero sense. And I mean, I remember one time where I was having a struggle with her to be in the bathtub because she was afraid of sharks. I'm like, there's no fucking way sharks can get in the bathtub.
Sure. We build this huge thing up, we build this huge fear, this expectation that this experience is going to be awful, or all of these just hyper unrealistic what ifs that we throw out there. And then our brains are so powerful, it's so easy for us to program them to freak out, but it should be that easy to program them to chill out too, but it's simply not.
No, absolutely not. So I asked my daughter after the fact if I could share this, because in this moment of panic, and I'm a trained professional, I'm supposed to know how to handle this. And as a parent, we're driving home. As a parent, there's this part of me that's like, and explain to me, or maybe you've had this experience, or you listening, a child's freaking out. And as a parent, I'm like, don't you see the time and money I've put into this trip? Do you see the sacrifice? I never get to take a vacation. A ton of kids would want to be going on this trip. You're crying and throwing a fit and you don't want to go. And in my head, that's one part of me. And then the other part of my head is going, this poor kid is clearly struggling and I don't want to shut her down. And then the anxious part of me is, don't fuck it up as a parent.
A lot going on there for you.
Oh, this is my head all the time. So I came up with this great idea, and I'm going to read this passage, and she told me it was okay, because one thing that's really cool about my daughter is she recognizes sometimes examples help other people. So we came up with an idea. I said, why don't you go home and we're going to start a worry journal. And she went in my bed and she sat down and she wrote the following. She said, today is about a month away from my trip to Canada, and I'm excited to explore and travel. This is my first time going on a plane, a cruise, or out of California. Even though I'm excited, mind you, she's 10, I'm also scared and worried about what will happen on the plane or cruise or in Canada. Right now, I'm really scared and wondering, will anything bad happen on my first trip? I have no idea how it feels like being on a plane or in a cruise. I'm scared of the ocean with the sharks, rocks, and other things going through the ocean. I'm thankful for my mom because she's helping me when I'm scared, and started crying. She told me she's scared too, because side note, I am freaking the hell out over the plane ride. I used to be fine, and now all of a sudden planes are way up there, right? Doesn't make any sense.
You think it's different because your kids are with you?
I'm going to be real honest. I think I'm less worried now because I don't know. Before I was afraid I was going to die in a plane crash and leave them without a mother. And now I'm like, if we die in a plane crash, we die all together. These are the things that go through my head.
There's that positive spin.
Look, we pride ourselves on being real here with the podcast. So she said she promised to hold my hand when I'm scared, and I promised to hold her hand when she gets scared. On this trip, I will be a risk taker and take risks and have fun with my family, because their school has certain attitudes and attributes that they try and push. And one of them is being a risk taker in a positive way. So I'm reading this and I start bawling. She's reading it out loud to me. And I was just like, God, why? What is this anxiety nonsense, and why? And why do we as adults and kids have to deal with it? I don't know.
Pretty insightful, pretty deep for a 10-year-old.
And look, maybe there's a little bit of me that's like, yeah, look at my kid's got her shit together, even when she's falling apart. But I think that exercise is a great one, because those are lines you could say, right?
Sure.
You could find yourself feeling those things in moments, and we don't validate them.
Well, there's this, there's this part of us that feels like whatever we're feeling and whatever we're going through, especially in a moment of anxiety, when we're tuned into ourselves and we know that let's talk about that dichotomy, right? There's this part of you that knows that what you're feeling, it's very real because you're feeling it, right? You're having all of
Mhm.
these visceral reactions, some of them visible to other people and some of them very internalized. And then there's this other side of you that's very rational and that knows that whatever this fear is that you're feeling is ludicrous. And so you've got these two very different thought processes happening in the same brain, fighting against each other. And in those moments, like, some rationale needs to take over and bring you back down, right? And kind of quiet that noise and bring you back down to some ground level where you're able to reflect and make sense of what you're feeling, right? And having some sort of mantra or some sort of, it's cheesy but happy place that you go to when you're in those moments to bring you back, that can be paramount to having a moment that spirals you or having a moment that you're in control of.
You say it's cheesy, and I think sometimes we do say that and we minimize it. But as I'm talking to you, I'm in my office. I have a picture of my happy place, which is on a hammock in the middle, like backpacking in the Sierra Nevadas, and I have a sign next to it, and it sits on my desk so my clients can see it and I can see it. It says, "Calm the hell down."
It's
we do
perfect.
we do need those things. And so as you're listening right now, I mean, I challenge you to think of what your happy place is. And it's something kind of silly from our childhoods, but that is important because this actually ties into the idea of mindfulness and grounding when it comes to being locked in that part of your brain where you're panicking. Because basically, when you're in those moments, you're in fight, flight, or freeze mode. And you cannot utilize the more logical parts of your brain when you're functioning from a more basically survival instinct. So, Cynthia, what are some things that you've done in those moments? I mean, are there images you pull up, mantras that you do, suggestions?
Sure, sure. So I have been blessed with a niece and nephew, and
They're so
anytime
cute too. Oh my goodness.
they're out of control. My nephew is absolutely crazy, and my niece is 4 years old and can tell all of us how to run our lives. So there's that. But I find in times like of heightened anxiety, like even just thinking about them, thinking about times with them, it calms me. It calms me down pretty well. I have found hobbies and things that relax me so that I stop myself from getting to those points where when I don't have an outlet, a lot of that energy, can quickly turn to anxiety.
Are
And
these
so,
busy? Are these like busy work hobbies, like where you're moving a lot or having to
yeah,
concentrate and think? Okay.
yeah. So I fancy myself an amateur woodworker. I'm definitely not any good at it, but I enjoy it, and I keep I keep making little things. So in that, for that, it allows me, I put my headphones on, I've either got music going, I've got a podcast going that I'm listening to, and I can just work. I can just dive in, disconnect my mind a little bit where it gives me something tangible to focus in on. Where if I try to do something that's too sedentary, like watching a movie or reading a book, I find that for me, it just makes my mind wander off right back to those anxious thoughts. So for me personally, getting up and doing something where I'm physically moving, and once I get that started, I'm great. I can go for hours. My partner doesn't understand how I don't take a break, but it's really helpful for me because it gets that energy out in a physical way instead of having it just manifest inside.
People ask me why I exercise all the time, and that is the number one reason. Well, actually, the number one reason is because I like to eat a lot of food, and a lot of it's horrible for me. But the second is that just that physical release. Sometimes, if you're one of these more tightly wound individuals, having something, whether it's physically exhausting your body or something like you said that requires a lot of concentration and skill, and also movement, it is important to do. And because I find if I'm trying to watch a movie or read, if I'm in an anxious place, I'm not I'm not able to focus. I'm thinking about a million other things. And so it can be really, frustrating on top of anxiety provoking.
Sure. Because sometimes, sometimes I'm tired from between, work and just life in general. Sometimes you're just tired, but anxiety doesn't really always take a break. And so you can be in this great place otherwise, and it decides it's going to creep up at the most inopportune moments. And I know what making me feel better is going to be getting up, doing something, cleaning something, whatever that is in that moment. But man, sometimes you're just tired. But exercising that relaxation, like saying, okay, you know what? I'm just going to watch a movie. It becomes a less enjoyable activity because of the state of mind that I'm in, where, again, like you said, you wind up frustrated and annoyed that you can't even sit down and just chill out and watch a movie for an hour without feeling that motor inside of you just driving you forward.
Yeah. So I think it's important to think about coping skills. What I want to kind of turn from here now that we have a little background on the guest that's joining us, Cynthia, once again, Deanna out for this week. I want to jump into, I've got my nifty pocket-sized DSM. Now the DSM is the diagnostic criteria. Basically, it's from the American Psychiatric Association. This is what we use to make official diagnosis of different things. And there's a whole section on anxiety disorders. Now, one that you mentioned in childhood, or you mentioned that your anxiety was present from childhood, separation anxiety is often something that's noticeable in children. It's typically, it comes in waves too, where when like newborns start to actually can see and recognize their primary caregivers, so they might be a little uneasy with strangers. That's normal. Then around, I want to say it's around 18 months, there's this new kind of separation anxiety that comes up, and it kind of goes in waves. But when it's over the top, when it's recurrent or excessive distress, when anticipating or experience separation from a major attachment figure in home, that is one of the criteria for separation anxiety. So I don't want to get too far into it, but you've heard that with children.
Oh, absolutely. I suffered massively from separation anxiety.
Did you have a hard time like sleeping away from home and things like that?
Oh, I was totally that kid that every sleepover, like you'd be all pumped up for the sleepover. And then the minute it started getting dark, as an adult now, I can look back and I know that it's anxiety. But as a kid, I didn't know what to call it. But I knew that I needed to go home, and I needed to go home then. And it wasn't until I was probably 14 that I ever stayed anywhere outside of my grandparents' house or at home with my parents.
So there's also adults too that this carries into. Now the time frames are a little different, but that makes perfect sense, right? That you were experiencing these things and then later on in life, you've finally got a name for it. So
yeah,
we don't want to, obviously like suggest a diagnosis for any kid that has a problem being away from an attachment figure, but it is something to think about. And one of the ways that it manifests, you probably see this, have heard of this or seen this, is in physical symptoms. And that can include headaches, stomach aches, nausea, vomiting when separation occurs or is anticipated. You're laughing. Is that? That's the laugh of someone who knows.
I'm just wondering if I wrote you an email in my sleep last night and I described some stuff to you and you're like, okay, now I'm going to read it.
How do you, when you're separated from somebody, how do you experience that anxiety? Do you still feel it or no?
Very rarely. I think I've had one incident of that, and it wasn't necessarily separation anxiety from a person. It was kind of my environment.
Okay.
I was taking myself out of my comfort zone, and it was something so small and trivial to most people, but I was going out of town with friends and I wasn't taking my car and I was going to their family's house. And so there was so many layers of being out of my comfort zone that we didn't make it to the freeway before I had to have them pull over so I could vomit.
And it's real. And that's why when people downplay or minimize or wrongfully assign the word anxiety to things, it bugs the shit out of me.
Well, because in that moment, for the anxious person, trust me, for the person that's doubled over in the parking lot, throwing up in front of their best friends, people that they would trust their life with, the idea that spending the weekend with them out of town would have to necessitate pulling over so that they could throw up because they're so anxious, they're so nervous about that. It's humiliating. It's humiliating for that person. And at least for me, I'm also very aware of the way that I'm making other people feel. And so I know that for them, they had to feel awful. They had to feel awful for me because I felt that way. I think I would feel confused about like, whoa, like, where's this coming from? Did I do something? And then that again, there's that anxiety, right? Like, did I do something? Was this me? And so then there's this whole other layer of not only did I have to embarrassingly throw up on the side of the road, but I also, there's this sense of being out of control, you know, and not having your shit together.
That's painful, especially for somebody who wants to have their shit together.
100%. And it's so frustrating because you really truly can be so powerless to it. I could tell story after story about times where my anxiety has manifested in itself that it's alienated other people, and it was 100% not their fault. It was everything that had to do with my own issue, my own anxiety that they wound up suffering for. And I'm lucky and so thankful that in that moment with friends when we were headed out of town, I didn't get any shit talk when I got back to the car. I didn't get any guilt trip. There was no making me feel bad. It was all love and support. And for me, that's paramount to anybody suffering with anxiety. Those relationships can be very hard to find where people hear you and understand you, and they may not necessarily have experienced it, but they can love you through it because they know that on the other side, like, you're just you, and it's just a small part of who you are.
And I think part of it, this whole, as we talked about anxiety today, is to, one, know that the issues you're dealing with, and two, to be able to verbalize them, because if you weren't able to, then sometimes, friends can say the wrong thing or not the right thing, or it just gets lost, and then there's this potential for additional pain on top of it, because it can be difficult to have relationships with people who deal with anxiety disorders, because you mentioned your friends and I mentioned my daughter. Like, there's the part of me that's like, can't we just go and do this and have fun? But you've got to think about the way you interact can have implications
definitely
later.
And for the anxious person, I feel like we're always inside of our head.
Always.
And not only are we breaking down things that others have said and done and that we've said and done, we're breaking down the reactions, and there's just this snowball effect that it leaves all of these areas open to interpretation, and it leaves all of these questions open that are literally questions and doubts that our very minds are manifesting that have nothing else to do with anybody else. But to our mind, they have everything to do with everybody else. And so it's very hard. It's very hard for the person on the other side of the anxious friendship to have patience and understanding, because it's something that seems so controllable, I guess.
Right. Like, just don't think about it.
Right.
How many times have you been told, just don't think about it? Or when people minimize it. I'm thinking of something. So I remember a while back, this was a while ago, I have a fear of, if I don't hear from people, I'm afraid they're dead on the side of the road. This is not a control thing of, I need to know where you're at or keep your tracker on your phone or anything of that. It's that if you're running late, my initial thought, I'm not mad, I'm scared. I'm scared you're dead on the side of the road. Or if I don't hear from you, and I'm supposed to. And I remember having this kind of vulnerable conversation with someone I was dating at the time. And I was like, listen, I don't know anybody in your family. I just know you, and really starting to kind of like you right now. So this is going to sound silly, but I need you to give your phone number to, a couple of family members. And he was like, why? I said, because if something were to happen to you, how am I supposed to know? They're going to call next of kin. They're not going to call me. And
you're just going to be ghosted.
I know I'm going to be ghosted because he died on the side of the road. But it was this really weird moment, and he went along with it. He just, he kind of was trying to understand, but it was just listen, I know it doesn't make any damn bit of sense, but that's just inside my head.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely not a disease of rationality. Even in the moment that you're being ridiculous, but you have to satisfy it. You have to satisfy that need to know, that drive to know. Just yesterday, I was messaging my best friend, and I had a gift idea for her partner. And I said, hey, what do you think she'll think of this? I'm thinking about getting it for her birthday. And she wrote back and she goes, oh, if you haven't got it yet, I would wait. It's the kind of a long explanation, a long explanation, unfortunately. And I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't get it. We'll talk about it later. So the day wears on and I'm like, long explanation? What's a long explanation? And so then here goes the spiral, right? Like, so then I don't think, maybe they're going to be out of town that week. Maybe they're, because it was a ticket for an event.
Okay.
Maybe they're going to be out of town for that week, or they already got tickets for that or something like that. Oh no. It was, so it starts to unravel in this crazy way. So finally I had to message her and I was like, hey, is everything okay? You guys all right? And she's like, yeah, we're great. Why? Well, long explanation. She was like, yes, we're fine.
So you immediately went to the terrible places.
Totally. Every single time, if my sister's not getting back to me, it's because the house is flooded with carbon monoxide and everybody's dead, not because maybe they're in the pool.
This is so real. Oh God. And to reiterate, we are not laughing because we are minimizing this. We are laughing because that is the sound of someone who absolutely checks the carbon monoxide detectors regularly.
I pushed the button in the middle of a conference call the other day. I had to throw it so that it would stop. I was so embarrassed. I was like, oh my God.
Oh, okay. So we've touched on separation anxiety and figured out that you probably had it. Also in the particular section of the DSM that I'm talking about, there are specific phobias and selective mutism. We're not going to get into that, but one that people bring up all the time is social anxiety disorder, social phobia. Now, we can agree that sometimes being in social situations can be nerve-wracking for anybody. But this is when it becomes a clinical issue, when it starts to interfere with relationships, when it starts to interfere with daily functioning. And there is a complete list of criteria, once again, that makes this a diagnosable disorder. Just to bring a few up, it includes, let's see here, most social situations always evoke fear or anxiety. They're avoided or endured with intense fear or anxiety. It's out of proportion to the actual threat posed by the situation. There's a duration part that is in there. And again, on all of these too, it also says that it's not part of a physiological effect of a drug use or drug substance use. So social phobia can be a real thing. Now, being uncomfortable in crowds or being a little introverted is a little different, but this is, again, where it becomes debilitating and something that can be really, really hard in a workplace or if you're a kid going to school. Panic disorders, you know how people say they have panic attacks, or you hear that often?
Oh, all the time.
Okay, again, this is where people misuse words and it drives me crazy.
Yep.
So panic attacks happen out of nowhere and they can feel like you're dying. There's a whole list of physiological effects that come from it. But the point being that panic attacks are unpredictable. Now, you can say there's not really an anxiety attack, but people say anxiety attacks where they get triggered by certain situations. But panic attacks, again, there's no rhyme or reason to them. I had a friend who got one because he felt like he was having a heart attack after working out really hard. And now it's totally messed up him working out because every time his heart gets elevated, now he's got this disorder. So
like a fear that it's going to happen again, or
so panic disorder is basically having unexpected panic attacks. Now then you get into anxiety and there's a lot of gray area here, but The point being that a panic attack doesn't have a trigger. It just happens. And one of the most successful ways to cope with a panic attack is to recognize you're having a panic attack and then talking yourself through it. Breathing. Okay, I'm not dying. This is just my heart racing really fast. I'm sweaty. I'm having a panic. It's basically getting out of that fear spot that you're going, oh my God, people go to the hospital all the time for panic attacks. They think they're dying. It feels like they're dying. But one of the best ways to cope with it is to recognize that you are having a panic attack. Again, I feel like I always have to do disclaimers. Go see a professional. We are not intended to replace professional treatment by any means. Have you heard of agoraphobia?
Oh, definitely. Sure.
Yeah. Agoraphobia, for those wondering, is another anxiety disorder, and it has to do with being in certain places. So you get these people sometimes that will just live in their house. They're afraid to be outside in wide open spaces. They're afraid to be in crowded spaces. And it is absolutely debilitating. And it can include using public transportation, being in open spaces, being in enclosed places like a theater or cinema, standing in line or being in a crowd, or even just being outside the home alone. And this can make someone's world absolutely tiny.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely tiny. I worked with a client once who was fine. Something happened, and then he developed agoraphobia, went from being fully functioning with a job and attending college to going out to dinner with a partner was terrifying. Now, the good news is with treatment and help, he's fine. He goes to concerts all the time now, so that's kind of awesome.
Well, just that acknowledgement and getting in to talk to the right people can be so powerful. I know with my own anxieties, not necessarily related to that, but in my own, there's peaks and valleys, right? So you have really good days and really bad days, and you can look over a span of time where you're like, man, for that year, there was a period of time that Frances mentioned where it was just kind of dark. There was about a year there where I wasn't really reaching out to anybody. And then there are times where it's excellent. It's amazing. Things are going amazingly, and there can be that digression, and that can bring your anxiety up all on its own, right? Because I think there's a lot of pessimism that comes with anxiety, and that pessimism is constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Right.
When things are good.
Yep. And this is something that I work on myself and also with clients. A particular client I'm thinking of had a real hard time about a year ago and is back in school and functioning and doing really well. And she's just waiting. She's waiting. And so if any little bit of anxiety pops up, she is afraid she's going to go right back to that bad place. But this is where I tell you, if you do the work and continue to do the work to take care of yourself and develop your coping skills during the good parts, you will recognize when the bad, I guess, is creeping in, and you'll have the skills to deal with it. So for instance, think about a car. To go from 0 to 60, some cars may get to 0 to 60 really fast, but they still have to pass 5, 10, 15, 20, all the way. So it's the same way with our anxiety. It's possible that we can get better at recognizing it sooner and stopping it when it's maybe at 30 instead of 60, or doing the things that we need to do to keep it like manageable. That's the other thing. I don't know how many times I've had to tell myself or a client, just get used to carrying that backpack that's anxiety, Yeah. And some days it's going to be heavier and some it's going to be lighter, but maybe we just need to get past this idea of that you're just going to get rid of it and you're never going to have it.
See, and that really is paramount to kind of where I'm at with my anxiety, with my struggle with that. Since getting an official diagnosis, that was, I guess about 16 years ago, I guess I've been waiting to be cured. I've been waiting for the right medicine to come along, the right combination of something, for my personal body chemistry to change, and that it's going to be gone. That period of time where I was just kind of dark, I was not taking medication any longer. I was trying to manage it in a different way. My thought process was, I'm in a different place in my life. Maybe my brain is too. And I gave it a shot, and it was just like the worst thing I could have done for myself. Your reference to just get ready to carry that backpack is perfect, because I've been trying, and it's an active process all the time, to recognize that it's probably not meant for me to put the backpack down. The backpack is mine. And the best course of action is probably to own the backpack, shift the stuff around that's in there, lighten your load as much as you can, and choose to keep, there are going to be things that are going to be kept in there whether you like it or not, but the things that you can shed, the things that you can work through and get rid of them. But for me, settling into that idea that this is who I am. I'm anxious by nature. It's just part of my, I don't want to use the word personality because that's not right, but it's just part of my makeup. And so coming to peace with that has been really empowering to know that, okay, now what?
Right. I love that. Now what? And embracing it, because I always mess it up. One of these days, before these podcasts, I'm going to look up the difference between analogy and metaphor and actually remember it, but I can't, so it doesn't matter. Try to overlook that. I round up and say I'm 5'7". I will never be 5'8". I mean, I can put heels on, but I'll never be 5'8". And somewhere along the line, I just realized I'm never going to be 5'8". Why can't I just accept the fact that I'm always going to be dealing with some level of anxiety or depression?
Sure.
And if we look at it that way, whatever eye color you have or your build, there's things you can do to change it to make it something that you might like a little more, but you're always going to be that.
Well, there's also, we have to think about the generation that we grew up in is the 80s. So it wasn't the same sort of attunement to mental health and what those things meant. There was all this stigma. Mm-hmm. So I have a family rich with depression and anxiety issues. So I grew up hearing about Prozac. I grew up hearing about medications. And especially as a kid, I guess when I thought about medications, you think about something being cured.
That's a good way to point it. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. When you talk about going to the doctor, you're not necessarily thinking about long-term management. You're talking about getting better. How do I get better?
And by that, you mean have it go away.
Have it go away. And so if we set this expectation that, let's say we go about it all the right ways. We have a therapist, we're seeing a psychiatrist for meds. We're seeing a GP for making sure all the rest of us is healthy. We're exercising. We're doing it by the book. We're doing it perfectly. There's kind of this expectation that someday you're going to be well. And instead of having that expectation, actually, Frances, you were one of two people who talked to me about my expectations and really challenged me to look at them in a different way. And it's helped me tremendously. So with our expectations with anxiety or depression or any other health condition that's very real and so many of us deal with, if we can start looking at it like as, okay, now what? Now I need to manage this, instead of waiting around to be cured because I've spent my life disappointed that I'm not fixed yet. And what do I need to do to fix myself? When really, it's not that there's anything necessarily broken. It's just that I have to rearrange my pieces a little bit differently than people who don't have the issue do. And taking ownership of reorganizing those pieces and recognizing that it's a crappy hand to have been dealt. It sucks to have been dealt a hand that sets you up to have a challenge forever. But it is what it is. So we either lie down and cry about it or find a way to deal with it, I guess, right?
Right. And kind of reframing it. A couple things that I want to mention on that. Those experiences dealing with things like anxiety, I know for me, I would not have picked up on what's going on with my kid and a more appropriate, healthier way to process it with her if I would not have had those experiences myself. So part of me feels a little guilty, like I might have passed it on to her, but I also feel like I am very well equipped to help her manage it.
I'm so glad that you circled back around to that, because I wanted to say something earlier, but it just wasn't an appropriate time. Back in the 80s, our parents didn't know. They didn't have the same knowledge and set of resources. And especially for Trip and Angelina, they're going to have an even more unique experience because their mom is in the field and has her own issues and knows to recognize certain behaviors and certain things. Where I had very loving parents, very caring parents, but they didn't know what to do with that worry that I had. You know, getting up in the middle of the night and thinking that someone was outside of my window, like on a nightly basis. They didn't know what to do with that. They didn't know what to call that. And so generations now, especially those that are lucky enough to have parents that are open-minded to looking at things from that clinical perspective, not that anything's broken with your child, but just recognizing some of those behaviors. It's like, you know, do you feel bad that you quote unquote gave it to her? Or can you feel great that you are equipped with tools that your parents weren't, to help her to cope and to help her to feel better and more at peace in those moments? Like, that's a huge win.
Right. And I think that comes back around to kind of accepting where you're at and the cards you've been dealt. One thing I did want to mention, speaking specifically of living in 2018 and raising kids in 2018, is that we need to be very, very aware that there is a wealth of information about the world at their fingertips, and that they don't have the processing ability to take in a lot of the negativity that is constantly going on. So for instance, if you have the news going all the time, kids don't understand how to process that. Me as a 35, I almost forgot how old I am, 35-year-old woman, I cannot watch the news on a regular basis. And I'm very, very careful about what it is I'm doing, because God, when all the stuff was going on recently with North Korea and the Twitter fights back and forth, I thought we were going to get blown up, and my anxiety went to, it just went off. So we have to be super aware of what we're consuming. And the other thing I wanted to point out is I liked using the phrase well-adjusted. I don't like the term happy, because I think it's been, you can be happy, but I feel like I just want to be happy is cheap and doesn't define anything and isn't realistic. Being well-adjusted means you can enjoy life and the struggles that come your way. So whether your relationships are changing, your work is changing, maybe there's really good and bad times, but you can adjust. I just kind of, I don't know, for some reason, that's a phrase that I like to recommend to people, especially if they're dealing with something that's chronic, like an anxiety disorder, which, by the way, one last one I wanted to touch on is generalized anxiety disorder. And as you mentioned, it's this kind of keyed up feeling. It makes you tired, difficult to concentrate, or sometimes you just go blank, right?
Sure.
Yeah, irritability, muscle tension, and another big part of it is sleep disturbance. And so those are just some things. And the reason why we're going down the list is if you're experiencing some of these, we do recommend that you seek maybe an assessment or some extra help in that regard so that you can get the treatment that you need. Another thing that I don't mess around with drugs. My experience is very, very limited, and my drinking is very limited as well. And here's one reason why. A lot of substances can induce anxiety symptoms. And so sometimes that can be the thing that kind of flips the switch. So I'm going to give you my drug PSA here for a moment. Any sort of drug or alcohol can cause anxiety if that's what they kind of trace it back to. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Some of them have very significant roles in your anxiety. I do hear some people that, they like to use marijuana because it calms them down. For some people, it causes anxiety. You've heard stories of people that are out of their mind on stimulants, that are worried and paranoid that people are coming to get them. That happens. So just being aware that certain substances you put into your body can alter your mind so that they can feed an anxiety disorder. The other thing I want to mention is that saying I'm going to pop a Xanax because I'm I'm feeling a little on edge, that's for some reason become kind of a fun thing to say. Have you heard that?
Oh, well, I popped a Xanax right before we started recording, so I can't judge.
Well, I'm not saying judge, because again,
No,
I
but
mean,
I absolutely know what you mean. It's this sort of just it's very just trivializing and minimizing for people that actually really need it.
mhm,
To think about it like to treat Xanax like a shot of tequila to take the
yeah, yeah, or Valium, or insert whatever drug it is. And I just bring this up because they can be addictive. You do need to be careful with them. These aren't something that you want to be buying secondhand off of people or asking people for. And I am getting up on my high horse for this because I work in a clinical setting where I had a client who thought he was buying bars, and they had stimulants in them and everything else. So to just proceed with caution, and to think about, if you are self-medicating, that's a dangerous swimming pool with lots of sharks possible.
a bathtub of
A
sharks.
bathtub full of sharks. But as you mentioned, if it is something that you need, then yes, then use it, but be honest with the way you're using it, and also be in constant communication with your healthcare professional. For instance, there was a time in my life when I needed Ambien. I needed it to sleep. I was also the first one to tell my psychiatrist I didn't want it anymore. And so sometimes we have to be advocates for ourselves and ask those questions.
And sometimes it's hard to do that because it's that same self that likes that feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And holding ourselves accountable can be so hard, especially when something that you're doing in secret, and maybe somebody else doesn't even know that it's going on. So
Right.
there's nobody to hold you accountable but you owe it to yourself to be honest about it and to do right by your body, do right by your mind.
Right. And we talked about that a couple of episodes back, Deanna and I, where I've said I stay away from stimulants because I know I would like them. And when she needed to use a pain pill, she talked to her husband about that accountability. And it's just having that open communication. So as we're kind of wrapping this up, some ideas and places we want to send you for strategies to cope. You can talk to a healthcare professional, do a little background on things, including cognitive behavioral therapy, find someone in your area that practices it. That basically helps kind of stop that from a thought to like an automatic thought to a reaction. So that's important. Also want to bring up mindfulness. There's a reason why there are tons of apps out there that are teaching you how to do breathing exercise and guided meditation. Eastern culture has brought us a wealth of information in the idea of meditation and calming your mind and connecting your body. And there's a million ways you can go, and people think they have to go do yoga, but it's not. It could be a 5-minute guided meditation type thing, listening to white noise, whatever it is.
And sometimes I think that we have this just amazing technology around us. We have all of these incredible lights and bells and whistles. And so oftentimes when we go looking for solutions for things, I think we feel like they have to be these grandiose solutions.
Right.
Like they have to be this, this just brand new school of thought type of thing, this big highfalutin crazy idea, and some of the best relief that I have gotten in those moments is walking around the block. Walking around the block, just taking in sounds, looking at flowers, just being outside.
Smelling things that smell good.
Yes, not the inside of your dank office. And just little things, just those little things. There's some music that I like to listen to that when I listen to it, it makes me feel cooler than I think I am. So I'll put this music in and just walk around my house and just feel really cool all day. And that helps. It's just a little thing. But sometimes those solutions, just the little things, it really is the little things.
I think if there's one takeaway I could recommend to somebody who thinks that, they really kind of connect to some of these struggles with anxiety is get in touch with your senses, physical senses. Sometimes when we're in this anxious place, we are, like you said, too far in our head. And so being able to get back into the present and connect with our bodies can be extremely, extremely useful. So I would recommend that, whether it's, a quick one is box breathing, which basically you think four by four by four by four, inhale to 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, and then hold your lungs empty for 4. That's something that is super easy to do. No one is going to know you're doing it necessarily. Another one is progressive muscle relaxation, where you can do this in bed or even sitting in a meeting where you're tense. Start from your toes and kind of flex your feet all the way up, stage by stage, all the way to, through your body. And that can be a way of just kind of recognizing and releasing that tension. And one of the other most effective ways is, like, I know when I'm getting a stomach ache and it makes no sense why I'm getting it, I just stop and think, and I'm like, oh, I'm anxious. Like, I just name it. Like, hi, nice to see you again, asshole.
Just call it out. Welcome it to the table. Welcome it to the table. Tell, sit down and just shut your mouth. You can be here, but I don't want you to participate. Just own it.
Somebody, well, actually, I think I might have read this in a book. Don't ask me what book it was, but they explained anxiety as a yappy little dog. If you have a yappy little dog at your feet and you keep kicking it away, it's going to bug you. And if you lock it outside, it's going to get really, really annoying. But if you just pick up that yappy little dog and give it a little attention, it calms it down a little bit. And then, it might be hanging out around you and occasionally bug you, but it's a whole lot better than when you're constantly trying to lock it out.
Yep. Embrace it.
Right. So hopefully you have found this to be a helpful podcast today, all about anxiety. On a scale of 1 to 10, Cynthia, how nervous were you earlier? Because I gave you probably 20 minutes.
I don't get nervous very often, but today, yeah, I was a solid 8.5.
All right. And it wasn't that painful, right?
Well, no, I'll probably cry in a ball after we get done recording, but.
For real?
No, not for real. Okay.
You're handling it really well.
No, I mean, it's great. What our listeners can't see is that we can see each other on video chat. And so it's just like talking to my friend.
Which, by the way, I hate video chat. So every time I do a podcast, it makes me uncomfortable.
But you flip your hair around a lot.
I'm touching things, drinking things. So anyhow, as we wrap up, one of the things that I like to talk about is ways that you've pushed your comfort zone, but I think you're a fine example of doing just that today.
Thank you. It was a feat, but I feel good about it.
Right. You can go and do a little happy dance. One thing I want to finish with before we go is we like to share some feel-good news, and this one, okay, I'm going to start by prefacing this by saying it takes an act of Congress. Well, that's not a very good analogy. It takes a miracle. No, it takes a miracle for me to appreciate anything that has the word math in the headline. But this story says a random math teacher turns New York City subway into a classroom for a struggling dad. Somebody posted up a photo. It says Corey Simmons had been taking advantage of his lengthy New York City train ride to study up on math. His son, who was in the 3rd grade, was having trouble with fractions. So he took it upon himself to relearn the formulas. But considering it's been almost 30 years since he had elementary school math, he was having trouble with some of the problems. So as he's studying, a man sits down next to him and they strike up a conversation. This man is Dennis Wilson. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Dennis Wilson is the one that shot the photo. But this guy, he started talking to a math teacher. And so this trip turned into a full-grown man trying to learn fractions to help his 3rd grade son being helped by the random math teacher on the subway.
That's so amazing.
Oh, it just gives me the good chills. Like,
it's so good when we can just come together.
Right. Oh man, I'm hoping I can find this guy though, because I don't know fractions.
Hey, but I got fractions. I got you.
Okay, we got this.
I got you on the fractions.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. We want to direct you, if you haven't done so already, to please follow us, rate, and subscribe. And look, I'm getting ahead of myself and forgot one more thing. We like to do listener shout outs. And so we take those either in the reviews or if you send us messages on the different ways to get in touch with us. But so however it is you can get in touch with us, we do like to give you a little bit of a shout out. And this one is coming from Allison. She says, I've been binge listening to the podcast when I'm in the car. Started from the beginning. And even though I've tried to listen to other podcasts to mix it up, I can't. I'm so grateful you guys teamed up to do this. Listening to you guys talk is how my friends and I talk. Sometimes getting off track, but always coming back around. And always with real life strategies for coping, thinking, living, and other things that are relatable and we want to know about. She goes on to say, and being able to laugh out loud in my car by myself. Please keep up the podcast for a long time. So big thank you to Allison Marie for sharing that. If you haven't, please subscribe, follow, and get in touch with us. Deanna will be back, and she is Hilarious Humanitarian on Instagram. I am Shut Up Skippy, and we do have our Humanitarians podcast account. Well done. Well done, ma'am. You faced that anxiety.
Deanna has large shoes to fill, but
both have tiny little hands and dismembered body parts.
Yeah, that's right. Can't go wrong.
Cynthia, thank you very much. And the Hilarious Humanitarians podcast will be back next week. Bye. You can say bye too, because you're a guest.
Bye.